Good afternoon, everybody. So I hope you are in good health, you're staying safe, and that your businesses have started to bounce back if they haven't already. Welcome to the Franchise Your Business Seminar. So this is a seminar that Francorp has been conducting every month for over 20 years now. This is where we bring business owners to a seminar such as this in order to tell them about franchising, um, is your business franchisable, and how to go about developing a franchise program. So I know many of you are probably here because you have gotten inquiries for franchising already. So maybe your customers or your friends or your relatives asked you, nagpa-franchise na ba kayo? Do you franchise your business? And so that's why you're here to learn more about it, to be able to know how to go forward. So there are several stages of being asked this question. For many, their first reaction to this question is one of disbelief or denial. So when they get asked, nagko-franchise na ba kayo? They can't believe it right away. No, they think, really? Somebody really wants to franchise my business already? The next stage of that process is one of glee, no? Or in Tagalog, it's parang kilig, no? But wow, people are already asking about whether they can franchise my business. So I already give off that impression, that image that the business may be franchisable. But after that, the third stage is something of panic. No? So many people go through that stage when they realize that although there is a serious inquiry and they really want to franchise a business, but I'm not sure how to go about franchising. I'm not sure about the legalities. How do I compute the fees? Do I need an operations manual? How do I go about marketing it? So there's that panic stage that sets in. And that's probably why a few of you started to join this seminar, to be able to move from that stage of panic to a stage of being informed and now being able to resolve and move forward. So the goal of the rest of this afternoon is to be able to give you more information about franchising on top of what Lito has already showed you. Specifically, I'll be talking about determining the franchisability of the business, and also what are the steps that needed to be done in order to develop a good franchise program. So hopefully, from the panic stage, you now move to a stage wherein you have the resolve to move forward and franchise confidently. So talking about franchise inquiries, no, let's do a quick poll. And this is going to be the last poll. No? Let's do a quick poll on how many inquiries you've already had for franchising, no? if you've already had. So, so what we will do is flash the poll questionnaire in front of you, and please feel free to answer. No? So the choices here are in response to how many inquiries for franchising have you received? 1 to 3. And next to that is 4 to 10 inquiries. And the third would be more than 10. No? The last one would be none yet. Maybe there's no increase for franchising yet so far. Okay, so based on so I think most of you have already replied to this quick survey. Let me share the results. And as you see, majority of you have already received inquiries for franchising, no? About 93%. And of those, a good number majority of those had about 1 to 3 inquiries, and some even having about more than 10. No? So about more than 20% of you already have more than 10 inquiries. So that's quite good. No? Okay, so So you've had inquiries for franchising, and some of you may already have some familiarity with franchising because you've already seen it in the malls. Maybe you've even inquired about being a franchisee at some point. But one of your questions that is very relevant at this time is, would franchising still work during an economic slowdown, such as the one we are having right now? And the answer to that is yes. No, franchising is one of the sectors that bounces back quickly after the crisis or even during the crisis. And we've seen that with respect to the activity that we've been seeing the last few months. No? We've had a lot of businessmen like yourselves ask about franchising their business. We've also had a lot of activity in terms of people inquiring about buying a franchise. So these are people who used to work in a corporate setting or in a company that was laid off from their job and are looking for another way forward. They're looking for a business opportunity. Instead of working for a company, now they're looking to put up a business in their own, and they're thinking of doing that through franchising. Some OFWs who have come home and are not going back to where they used to work are also exploring. And even some business owners whose businesses are not doing as well as they used to are also looking to diversify into another field. No? So, for example, some of those in the tourism business, although that's temporary. So, yes, franchising still works even during an economic crisis, an economic slowdown, because it still provides a win-win situation for both the franchisor and the franchisee. Both of them benefit from this relationship, and um, therefore it works for both parties as well. We've also seen this internationally as well as globally. So during the subprime crisis in the US, in during around 2008, 2009, franchisees were one of the first to bounce back. This also happened during the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s and even during the Gulf War of the early 90s. So franchising still works, and it provides a win-win situation for both the franchisor and the franchisee. But let me qualify that. For a business to succeed as a franchise, number one, the business has to be franchisable. And second, the franchise program has to be professionally and correctly done. So if this is not done properly, then the business may not succeed as a franchise. No? So let me go into the details. So for a business to be franchisable, it has to um, it has to take into account the criteria that I have displayed on the screen in front of you right now. No? So there are 10 questions 10 criteria that we look at in order to determine whether a business is ready for franchising or not. And let me go through them in detail right now. Number one is credibility. So credibility comes in the form of brand recognition and also reputation of the ownership or the company. So the more credible the business is, then the more franchisable it is. The more recognized a brand is, the more familiar people are with the brand, the more favorable the reputation of the company is, then the higher the credibility, and therefore the higher the franchisability. So your question may be, we're only a startup business, although we have some awareness with our community, with the people, with our customers, the people who go to our stores, we don't really have a lot of brand recognition yet. So does that mean we're not franchisable? Well, fortunately, there are other criteria that we look at in terms of determining the franchisability of the business. Credibility is one, but there are other criteria that we need to consider as well. And second to that is differentiation. So how differentiated is your business? What is your unique selling proposition that sets you apart from the other businesses that are also selling franchises. So let me give you an example. About 3 or 4 years ago, we started working with a company called Medline. And Medline is a uh, clinic that offers dialysis services. So some of you may not be familiar with this franchise yet, no, because it's fairly new. But they're the first of their kind. They're the first one to franchise in the Philippines. And based on our research, they're also probably the first dialysis center franchise in the world. No? So they had very high differentiation because no one else was doing it before them. But they were the first to market. They were the pioneer in that particular service. Do you have to be, the question, do you have to be the first to market? Do you have to be the pioneer in order to have a unique selling proposition or a high differentiation? Do you have to be the first mover to be differentiated? The answer is no, no. You can be differentiated, you can have a unique selling proposition, even if you are operating in an industry where there are already brands carrying the same product. So another example of this is a company we worked with called Turk Shawarma. So Turk Shawarma started their business around 7 to 10 years ago. And when they started, shawarma was not new to the Filipino market. Filipinos had already had shawarmas for a long time, no? For many years, even before Turk shawarma came to the market. But where they were different was that they had a taste profile that was closer to the Filipinos' liking. No? So they served shawarmas that were sweet. The pita was sweet. The fillings were sweet. So they weren't authentic, and those who had Middle Eastern shawarmas would say that it's not really authentic tasting, but it didn't matter. Um, they did very well. Their sales were quite high, and so even if there were already shawarma players in the market, they were able to franchise, and they were be able to become successful in franchising. Aside from that, the preparation was also different. No? The traditional shawarmas were open roasted. They were sliced off a vertical skewer, and so they were prepared that way. No? But for Turk shawarma, the fillings, which was a choice of either beef or chicken, were already pre-cooked, and they were just heated right there. So it made the preparation faster, and it simplified the operation. So it also lowered the initial investment because there was no need to put up the roasting equipment. So they were able to offer a unique selling proposition in a market where there are already players, because they offered something different which the market found value in. Because of that, they were able to grow to about 700 branches already. And even though they were a cart operation, they were able to charge franchise fees of about 1 to 1.2 million. No? Those of you who are familiar with some familiarity with the franchise business, you would know that carts usually charge franchise fees from about 100 to about maybe 300,000. But Turk Shawarma charged well over 1 million, and there was still, in spite of that, there was still a long line of those who want to franchise a business, because the return on the investment was quite fast. The third criteria we look at is the transferability of knowledge. So when you franchise, you're supposed to train somebody to be able to run the business on their own. So the question here is, will you be able to train somebody who has no background in the business that you are in, or maybe in business in general? And will you be able to do that in a time frame, in a relatively short time frame? Because if you say that, yes, I can train somebody, but it will take me a year and a half to train them, then that may not be franchisable in its current form, or you may need to restructure it so that um, the franchisee will already know the business and is familiar with the technical details, or the franchisee may need to hire somebody who is technically skilled in rendering that type of service. For example, we've worked with many skincare brands like Flawless, Isa, and also Bello. No? Um, so for many of these concepts, they would have a dermatologist that would be present to offer medical advice to their patients. So of course they cannot have a franchisee come in and be trained in the medical practice for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, because it takes longer. No, it takes 8 years, 9 years of medical training to be a doctor. So what they did is that either the franchisee um, is a dermatologist, or they would be able to partner with a dermatologist who could come in and render medical advice several times a week. Next criteria we look at is adaptability. So how flexible is your business, and will it be able to adapt so that it can be successful even in different market environments? So the example we give here is one of McDonald's. So McDonald's is in many countries, and they are even in countries like India, where majority of the people don't eat beef. No? Because cows are sacred in India, McDonald's India does not have burgers, they don't have cheeseburgers, they don't have Big Macs. So in spite of not having a Big Mac, they have what's called a Maharaja Mac, which is the equivalent of the Big Mac. So instead of being made out of beef, the Maharaja Mac is made out of lamb. There is a variant made out of chicken. So they were able to adapt their offering in a country where they could not serve their primary products. So they were flexible enough and they were able to adapt it, and they were still successful because in spite of not being able to serve beef, everything else is vintage McDonald's, from the branding to the uniforms to the value for money proposition to the cleanliness to the quick service. They're all there, no, in spite of not having that flagship product. Number 5 criteria we look at is successful prototype. So do you already have a prototype of the business and the format that you want to franchise? The reason we put this is that sometimes we have inquiries by business owners who are successful in one particular format, and they want to sell a franchise of another format that they haven't tested yet. So for example, some of our restaurant clients are considering also selling a franchise in a cart or a kiosk format. So what we recommend is that before we start developing a program for this new format, that we test out this format first, that they test out the format first and have some success in it before it's franchised out. So we want to see proof of concept first before it is developed into a franchise program. Because just because they already have successful restaurant operations does not necessarily follow that if they were to migrate that to a smaller format, they would also be just as successful. Franchising is basically replicating a successful concept and a successful format. So we want to see proof of concept first before we go into franchising. We want to see a successful prototype first before we undertake development. Next criteria we look at is continuing value. So what value does the franchisee get from you after they've already gone through the initial training that will keep them as a franchisee if they already know how to run the business? So let's say you have a franchisee, you've trained them, and then um, since they already know how to run the business, they are mostly independent. If they're already familiar with how to run the business, what value would they get from staying in the franchise and having to pay you royalties and advertising contributions? Why wouldn't they just put up their own business and carry their own brand if they already know how to run the business anyway? They remain as a franchisee if they see continuing value staying within your brand and within your franchise network. So this is the continuing value proposition. So for many of our food clients, the way they continue to give value to their franchisees is that they supply the ingredients, they supply the proprietary products. So many food franchises don't teach the recipes to their franchisees. This is so that the franchisees will not be able to go off and do the business on their own. And also, it protects them so that the franchisee will continue to source their products from the franchisor. There's also some benefits because it simplifies the operations and it makes it less complicated for the franchisee to perform every day. No? But mostly there is an aspect to protecting the proprietary knowledge of the franchisor. This continuing value criteria is really more of a challenge for many service type businesses, like for salons, for spas, for nail salons, etc. This is because after they're already trained the franchisee to cut hair or to do massage, then it's much more difficult to find continuing value to keep the franchisees on board. But they render continuing value in other ways. No? For example, the strength of the brand name is also a continuing value because if the franchisee were to start the business on their own, they may not have the same support and patronage from the customers. Franchisors also render continuing value through their support services, without which the franchisees would not be able to have the same level of sales. Okay. Next, we look at affordability as a criteria. So the more affordable the investment in your franchise, then the more franchisable it is. So that's why for many years, the most sellable franchises, the most popular franchises are the carts, the kiosks, counters, small stores. This is because the investment needed to put up a franchise branch is quite low. No? Compare this to investment in, let's say, a full restaurant, a dine-in restaurant, and so on. But we also look at the return of investment on that franchise. Because even if a franchise investment is very affordable, but if it takes a long time to get a return on that investment, then it's not going to be attractive as a franchise. But this is why even if the investment in Max's, the investment in Jollibee would go to about 30 to 50 million for a standalone store, they're still aligned to become franchisees because the return of investment is quite attractive and is very predictable. Number 9, we also look at market trends and conditions. By this, we mean what is the demand for your product or service, and is it sustainable over many years? No? And the reason we put this in is that we try to avoid franchising businesses that are what we call fad businesses, FAD. Fad businesses are those that are doing very well because um, people people buy their products, but the longevity is not there. No? They're doing very well, but they will burn out very quickly. So an example of this would be in Scramble. If you're familiar with this, maybe about 8 to 10 years ago, there were many. If you went to the mall, there were many brands selling Scramble. No? The Scramble is a Pinoy refreshment that has crushed ice, shaved ice, and also syrup. No, the more colorful the syrup, the more outrageous the color, then the more attractive to the eyes. No? So there was a time when the malls would have these, and they would have maybe three, four brands all over the mall. But these were very short-lived, and in about 4 or 5 months, many of these brands were already gone. No? Many of them didn't even make it to to the renewal, no? Because people stopped buying them after a while. So we'd like to see the demand for your business, the demand for your product, your service, be sustainable over the next few years, no? At least until the term of the agreement. Last is capital. So franchising is a low-cost means of expanding your business, but it is not a no-cost means of expanding your business. So let me say that again. No? Franchising is a low-cost means of expanding your business, but it's not a no-cost means of expanding your business, which means that although it is low-cost because it's the franchisee who puts up the capital and they spend uh, on on putting up the store, as a franchisor, you will still need to invest some capital in developing your franchise program and preparing for franchising. The capital you need to invest in franchising would be in developing the franchise program, having somebody write the franchise agreement, spending time and the thought process of business planning, creating an operations manual, and maybe preparing your infrastructure, increasing your commissary capacity, improving your logistics, maybe increasing your warehouse, and so on. No? So you still need capital to go into franchising, even if it's lower than capital that you would spend if you only expanded through company-owned businesses. So this is the criteria we look at in terms of franchisability of the business. To summarize this, we would like to see that the franchise business would work on three levels. So it must work on the franchisor, for the franchisor, it must work for the franchisee, and it must work for the customer. So this is what we call the win-win-win scenario. If it doesn't work for any of these three, then it will not be franchisable as a business. For example, if it only works for you as a franchisor, you're making money, you're able to sell franchises, but your franchisees are struggling, they're closing down, then it's not going to be sustainable. No? It's not going to be successful for a long time. If the franchisee is doing well, but the franchisor is struggling, then this will also not result in a successful franchise business. So you might be asking, does that happen? The franchisees are doing well, but the franchisor is not doing as well or as well as they should. You'd be surprised that this can happen, especially with what we call DIY or do-it-yourself franchisors, wherein they do their own computations and they create their own franchise policies. Sometimes the franchisees are doing very well and the franchisor is not doing as well because the fees are not charged correctly. Maybe the franchise fee is very low or the royalty is quite low. No? In fact, just last week, we spoke to a business owner who was already in franchising. He did a do-it-yourself approach to franchising. And although he had many franchisees, he had about 20 already, he would still have to go to the commissary every day to prepare the ingredients and to prepare items that will be supplied to the franchisees. And he said that was because um, they didn't have enough not to be able to hire persons to do that. So there's something wrong with the fees in that case. A question you might have no, looking at franchisability criteria is, do we have to have all of those criteria in order to be franchisable as a business? The answer is no. No? We've worked with some companies that are very strong on some criteria, but not as strong on the others, and still came out to be successful franchisors. For example, when we worked with the generics pharmacy more than 10 years ago, when we first visited their branch, at that time they only had one branch. No? That branch of theirs was not really laid out very well. Um, they did not, they were not using the brand name they are using today. It was not lit very properly. It was quite dark, and they only had one branch. But since then, they've grown from that one branch to 2,000 branches within 8 years. So, um, and although they were not yet very established in the beginning, they had a high differentiation. Their At that time, the generics law was just passed, and they were one of the first ones to sell generics only medicines. They were also quite high in terms of um, affordability and the return of investment. So franchisees could put up a generics pharmacy store for about 600, 700,000. And where they were really outstanding in was in terms of the return of investment. So many of the franchisees were able to get back their investment within 6 months or less. So many of those franchisees bought a second franchise, a third franchise. In fact, their biggest franchisee owns more than 100 stores. So, so that's an example of a business concept that did not have all of the criteria, but were very strong in some of them. Okay. Okay, so the next criteria for you to succeed as a franchise is the franchise program has to be professionally done. And how do you develop a franchise program professionally? The way that Francorp does it for our clients is we go through these at least 5 steps no, in developing a franchise program. So let me start with number one, franchise structure. So in the structure component of franchise development, we identify what the sources of revenue for you as a franchisor. How will you make money as a franchisor? So the most common ones would be franchise fee, royalty, which is a percentage of sales that the franchisee pays to you every month, a percentage of their sales, and also the sale of proprietary goods and services to the franchisee. So you need to identify what the sources of revenue are, and also to determine the correct amount that you will be charging your franchisees. When I say correct amount, as I mentioned earlier, these are the fees that would result in a win-win setup financially between the franchisor and the franchisee, and would result in an attractive return on investment for the franchisee. For example, when we compute franchise fees, the methodology we use is that we adopt what's called a cost recovery approach. By cost recovery, we say that to compute franchise fees, we need to determine what your costs are every time you have a new franchisee. And this is different from what most do-it-yourself franchisors uh, or some other developers would do in computing the franchise fee or other revenue streams. No, what they would do is that they would look at what others are charging and then they would copy those amounts. No? So our approach is to identify what your costs are every time you have a new franchisee. So These are some of the most common expenses a franchisor incurs every time they have a new franchisee that comes on board. Their cost of advertising and marketing, sales commission. You may want to pay commission to your sales team or to your, if you have a broker that you hire. Um, their cost of initial training. You have to train the franchisee, and training costs money in terms of trainer salaries, training materials, and so on. No? Site assistance, the franchisee would rely on you to let them know if the site that they are proposing is acceptable and will do well as a franchise store, or they might even ask you to suggest a location to them. So there are costs of evaluating a site, going to the site and doing a market study, determining what the traffic drivers to the location are, and so on. No? If the location that's being evaluated is, for example, out of town, then you would probably have to travel there and determine if the site is acceptable or not. Startup assistance. So many franchisees don't have any experience in business before, and they would seek your assistance in terms of registering their business, getting a license, getting the permits, and so on. There's general and administrative expenses, which are internal expenses for your company, and there's also X factor. No, so this X factor expense I will explain in the next slide. But the point here is you need to determine what your costs are every time you have a new franchisee and add them all up. No, and so in this particular example, it costs you 180,000 each time you have a new franchisee. So if you didn't go through this exercise and you just decided to estimate and you said, okay, I'll charge 150,000 for each new franchise. So that means you're losing 30,000 pesos each time you have a new franchise because you didn't go through this exercise of determining how much does it cost you every time you have a new franchisee. Okay, so once you've determined what your total costs are every time you have a new franchisee, um, that's the time you can look at what similar concepts are charging in terms of franchise fees, and you can determine whether you want to price lower or higher than them. But at least you have a starting point, no? If you already know the costs each time you have a new franchisee coming on board. We suggest that franchise fee is more of a cost recovery mechanism, meaning that you charge enough to cover your expenses, but don't go overboard and charge a high margin on top of the costs you already have. This is because if you look at the costs, if you look at the cash flow you will be receiving as a franchisor over the life of the franchise relationship, you would see that your major source of revenues will come from royalties, from sale of products, um, instead of the one-time franchise fees. So it doesn't make sense to charge a very high franchise fee, which will only discourage franchisees from signing up when it's not your main source of revenue anyway. So the more prudent approach, smarter approach, is to charge enough of a franchise fee to recover your costs, and then to make money on the ongoing royalties and the sale of products. Okay? Makes sense? I mentioned X factor no, as one of the expenses. It's just a graph that uh, that shows the relationship between support costs and royalty income. So your support costs are high in the beginning because the franchisee is not yet familiar with running the business. So you may have to visit them more. Um, you may have to call them more so that they become more familiar with running the business. And eventually, once they're more familiar, then your support costs would go down. But in the beginning, their sales are not yet very high because they're just establishing their business. Customers are still not yet familiar with the branch or their products. So their sales are low, and the royalty that's paid to you in the beginning is also low. But eventually, The royalty increases because their sales increase because of repeat customers, there's more brand awareness, and so on. So there's a point um, within a few months where the royalty would increase the support costs that you are incurring. But before that time, the difference between the support costs that you incur and the royalty that you are earning should be charged as one of your setup costs. Okay, so after franchise structure, the next thing that needs to be developed is the franchise agreement. So this is the contract that will be signed between you and your franchisee. These are the most common terms in the franchise agreement. No? Franchise agreement has to be specific on how long the franchise is, what is the term of the agreement. Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 7 years or longer? What are the renewal periods and what are the renewal provisions? Are there any renewal fees associated with renewal? The franchise agreement has to be specific about the territory provisions. Okay? In the US, where franchising is quite widespread, um, the main cause of dispute between franchisors and franchisees is territory. So franchisees would say that they're already doing well, they're establishing themselves, and then the franchisor granted another franchise near them that cannibalized their sales. No? So you have to be very specific about territory provisions. Are you offering exclusive territory? If not, what are the conditions wherein you can give another franchise within the trading area? Of course, the franchise agreement has to be specific about the fees. If they're based on something else, if they're based on sales, if they're based on margins, that has to be clear in the franchise agreement. And what happens if those fees are not paid on time? Training provisions, who has to attend the initial training, and if there any refresher training or training for replacement personnel, that has to be mentioned as well. The franchise agreement also has to be specific about termination. No? What conditions, what violations would cause termination of the franchise agreement, so that it's clear, no? And that you can invoke those when the situation arises. Third thing you need to prepare in the franchise development process is the operations manual. So I see some of you raising your hand for questions now. So as Rhea mentioned in the beginning, we will compile all the questions and then ask them in the end, no? So that we will be able to allot enough time for the presentation. And if there are questions that are not answered at the end of the presentation, you can also raise those questions when you meet one-on-one with our consultants. So part of the seminar is a free consultation with our team. Next is operations. So this is a manual that you need to write, or that we write for you in the case where we're hired to develop your franchise program. And this is going to be the basis for teaching franchisees how to run the business and also the basis for training them. So this is a way for them to avoid past mistakes and inefficiencies. So many of you business owners are familiar with the fact that when you started the business and as you are growing that business, you had to have to go through many mistakes and errors, and just trying to find the right processes, the right suppliers, the right formula, the right recipe, and so on. No? So all those learnings would have to be included in the operations manual so that your franchisee would not have to go through those same mistakes anymore. So in a way, the franchisees are paying for your trial and error that you had to go through so that they won't have to incur those errors anymore. Okay? Next is marketing. So the next step in development is being able to market the investment opportunity. So once you have a franchise business plan, you have a contract, and you have an operations manual, the next step is to be able to tell people about it. to let them know that there's a franchise investment opportunity available, and these are its unique features. So this is where you determine who your target buyer is and where you want to go geographically, so that you can market the franchise offering. Last step is franchise sales. So this is where this step starts after somebody inquires if they can franchise your business, and goes all the way from making the presentation, doing your evaluation whether the franchisee would make a good candidate or not, up to the process of either accepting them as a franchise or rejecting their application. So this is a very critical step because um, in our experience, many of the problems that happen in franchise relationships could have been avoided if they did a better job of screening franchisees. So this is why we say that franchising is like a marriage, because you will be in you'll be in a relationship with your franchisee every day for the next 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. No? So, like a marriage, you have to pick your franchisees very carefully. So, do your due diligence, do your background checks, avoid whirlwind romances when it comes to selecting your franchisees. No? So don't be attracted by the money. Just because somebody has capital already to invest does not necessarily make them a good franchisee. So you have to do screening and background checks to determine whether you will be compatible with this franchisee for the next few years. That's why we say franchise sales is really more of an awarding process than a sales transaction. Because if it was purely a sales transaction, then that means anybody who has enough capital to invest will automatically be given a franchise. But that doesn't necessarily follow. No? The franchisee has to be qualified. They have to have the right values. They have to be compatible with your direction, with your work ethic before you give them a franchise. So that even if a franchise applicant has capital, but they don't have the right stuff, then you're better off rejecting their application than giving them a franchise just because they have enough capital. All right. So, so in ending, let me summarize the key takeaways from my presentation. Number one, franchising works well during good times, but it works even better during difficult times. And this has happened several times in the past, and we're also seeing this now, no? As we are going through this current economic crisis. But for a franchise to work, the business has to be, number one, franchisable, and there's 10 criteria that I presented. And number two, the franchise program has to be developed professionally and correctly. Because even if a business is franchisable, but if the franchise program is lacking, there are loopholes, and it's not done correctly, then it's going to be a waste of your brand, no? Because the business will not be successful as a franchise, and it will also make life difficult for franchisees as well as for yourself as a franchisor. So I guess in ending, let me say that the other advantage of franchise is that aside from growing your business quickly, you're able to make new entrepreneurs out of those who invest in the business. So, and then these franchise businesses are able to hire people. So you're able to give employment also. So franchising is a very effective tool, not only to grow your business, but to also help the economy, especially in this very difficult time.